Lieutenant Pierre Leclerc stood by the window of his concrete shelter, gazing out at the misty morning that had settled over the Normandy coast. The first rays of sunlight began to pierce the darkness, but their light only accentuated the emptiness of the beach. The sand stretched out before him, untouched and silent, with only the soft rustling of the wind breaking the stillness. He absent-mindedly cleaned the barrel of his rifle, his movements slow and deliberate, as if the simple task was the only thing that mattered in that moment. In his pocket, he could feel the crinkle of a letter from his mother. She had written, as she always did, that she prayed for his safety and awaited his return. He pressed the letter gently against his chest, his eyes narrowing slightly as he held it there, almost as if the letter was the only connection left between him and the distant home he hadn't seen in so long. The air was thick with a strange quietness, a silence that seemed too heavy for a morning in wartime. Pierre had seen the horizon many times before, but today it seemed different, as if something was amiss. His thoughts wandered, but before they could settle, the voice of his commanding officer, General Jean Lebel, echoed in his mind. Only yesterday, the general had declared that the defenses of Normandy were impenetrable. Pierre had no reason to doubt him. The line of fortifications they had built was formidable, designed to withstand anything that could come their way. Concrete walls towered above, machine gun nests dotted the landscape, and artillery positions were carefully arranged to cover every possible angle. Pierre felt the weight of these defenses behind him, providing him with a sense of security and a belief that no enemy could breach their lines. For weeks, life on the front had been routine. They had conducted drills, patrolled the area, and prepared for an attack that never seemed to come. The idea of an imminent invasion had become a distant thought, something that had been discussed and dismissed. But as he stood there, his rifle in hand, cleaning it methodically, Pierre's mind kept returning to the words of the general. "No one will get through. We are ready. We will win, just as we always have." His thoughts were firm, unwavering. He believed in his position, in the strength of the defense they had built. He believed in the invincibility of their line, a belief shared by every soldier around him. He looked out again at the stretch of empty beach. The calmness of the morning seemed almost surreal, as if the quiet before the storm was mocking them. But in Pierre's mind, this calmness was simply a prelude to the battle ahead. This was just another day of preparation, just another moment of waiting before the inevitable clash. He had done this countless times before, and there was no reason to believe that this day would be any different. He was ready. They were ready. The enemy would come, but they would be repelled, as they had been countless times before. Pierre felt a quiet confidence surge within him, a belief in the strength of his position and the invulnerability of the German forces. There was no doubt in his mind that the Allies would never breach their defenses. The thought of retreat, of defeat, didn't even enter his consciousness. The day ahead would be nothing more than another step in the preparation for a victory that seemed inevitable. As he stared at the horizon, the thought that the battle was already decided settled into his mind. They would win, as they always had, and the enemy would retreat in defeat. But as the minutes ticked by, a subtle shift began to take place. The weight of the silence around him seemed to deepen. The faintest hint of tension began to coil in his stomach, though Pierre could not yet pinpoint the source. He glanced at the letter in his pocket once more, almost as if seeking reassurance from the familiar words written by his mother. She believed in him. She believed in his strength, his resolve. And for a moment, he allowed himself to feel the comfort of her words. The war would go on, but this moment, this strange quiet, was his alone. And so, as the first light of day began to spread across the Normandy beaches, Pierre Leclerc stood resolutely at his post. He was a soldier, one among many, and his duty was clear. The enemy would come. They would try to breach their defenses, and when they did, They would be met with a line that was as steadfast and unyielding as the man who stood guard over it. There was no room for doubt. Victory was assured. But unbeknownst to him, the world outside his sheltered view was already shifting. The defensive line along the Normandy coast was nothing short of imposing. Towering concrete walls, massive machine gun nests, artillery positions, and miles of minefields spread across the beaches, creating the image of an impenetrable fortress. Lieutenant Leclerc and his platoon were stationed at one of the most crucial sectors of this front line, and everyone was confident that this defensive position would hold firm against any attack. Leclerc felt the weight of his duty pressing down on him. To protect the territory, to ensure that no enemy could set foot on the land they were sworn to defend. It was a clear and simple task in his mind, one that he believed would be carried out without question. For the past several weeks, the men of Leclerc's platoon had followed a steady routine of standard drills and patrols. They had run through the motions of preparation, honing their skills and solidifying their defenses. There was an unquestionable certainty in the air, a belief that preparation alone would guarantee success. The soldiers were assured that their lines were unassailable, that their weapons were more than enough to hold back any force that might attempt to breach them. "We are ready. We will not give the enemy a chance," Leclerc thought, standing steadfast at his post, listening to the words of his senior officers. These officers spoke with great confidence about the invincibility of their positions, painting a picture of defense so strong that even the most determined attack would be futile. The sense of security was overwhelming. They were ready for whatever the enemy could throw at them. The fortified defenses were in place, and every soldier was trained to the highest standard. Leclerc found comfort in these words, for they were more than just assurances. They were the foundation of his unwavering belief in victory. Each day that passed seemed to reinforce the certainty of their strength. The Germans had established one of the most formidable defense lines in military history, and Leclerc could feel it in the steady rhythm of his daily routine. They were more than just soldiers. They were protectors of an unyielding wall of concrete and steel. Meanwhile, intelligence reports continued to trickle in, warning of a potential Allied invasion along the Normandy coast. The idea of an invasion was not new. There had been rumors for months, but the reports were met with skepticism by the German command. These were merely the latest in a long line of false alarms, they believed. The idea of an Allied assault so massive, so coordinated, seemed impossible. The Allies simply could not break through the defense line that had been meticulously constructed. The reports, while concerning, were dismissed as exaggerated or perhaps even fabricated as part of a psychological tactic by the enemy to sow doubt and confusion. No one truly believed that such an invasion would occur on the scale that was being suggested. The German commanders were confident in their defenses, confident that the beaches would be held. Leclerc, like the other soldiers, dismissed the warnings. The battle ahead, he thought, would be another in a long series of skirmishes, another challenge to be overcome with the same certainty they had always felt. It was not a matter of if they would succeed, but when. His mind was set on the routine of their mission, defending their territory, holding the line, and waiting for any sign of the enemy to make their move. They would repel whatever assault came their way, just as they had been trained to do. But the reports continued to arrive, each one more urgent than the last. As the days passed, whispers began to circulate among the men. Some said it was coming, others shrugged it off as just another false warning. Leclerc's faith in the defense, in the impregnable line of fortifications, remained unshaken. The skepticism of the higher command echoed in his thoughts. How could the Allies possibly breach such a well-defended position? How could anything get past the walls, the guns, the mines? It all seemed impossible. As the days drew closer to what was supposed to be just another routine patrol, the unsettling sense of expectation began to grow. The soldiers could feel the tension building, even if they could not yet fully understand what was about to unfold. The quiet reassurance that had defined their existence on the front line was slowly being replaced by a quiet uncertainty, but only in the backs of their minds. The belief in their fortress remained strong, almost instinctively, yet there was a subtle shift in the air. Still, Leclerc and his men remained resolute. They would stand their ground, just as they had been trained to do. There was no alternative. This was their duty, their mission, and they would see it through. June 6, 1944. The morning dawned with an unusual silence, one that seemed to hang in the air and engulf everything around it. Lieutenant Leclerc woke from a restless sleep, his senses sharpened by the quiet that surrounded him. He listened intently to the radio broadcasts, each message more unsettling than the last. It quickly became apparent that the anticipated Allied assault had not yet begun. The weather, which had been calm just the day before, had worsened overnight. Thick fog enveloped the coastline, reducing visibility to nearly nothing. The sense of stillness felt ominous, as if everything was in suspension, waiting for something to break the calm. Despite the worsening weather conditions, the German command began to relax. The expectations of an imminent attack had slowly faded. The reports had been steady, but none had indicated the scale of what was about to unfold. In their minds, the defenses were impenetrable, and the Allies were unlikely to make their move in such dismal conditions. They dismissed the warnings that had been trickling in for days, feeling secure in their positions. There was no sense of urgency, only the quiet hum of routine. The soldiers went about their daily tasks, unaware that the storm of war was about to descend upon them with unthinkable force. Leclerc moved through his morning routine mechanically, trying to shake the feeling that something was amiss. He glanced at his watch, noting the time, as he prepared his weapon and checked the radio again. The fog outside the small window of his concrete shelter seemed to stretch endlessly, obscuring his view of the beach. As the hours passed, there was still no sign of the Allied forces, and the tension began to ebb away from the ranks. A few soldiers even laughed, remarking on the overly cautious reports. They felt secure, almost invincible in their positions. Yet, beneath the surface, Leclerc couldn't shake the nagging sensation that something was different today, something that didn't quite fit. Suddenly, the first signals of distress came through the radio. They were brief but unmistakable. Alarms began sounding from different corners of the coastline, sending ripples of panic through the troops. Leclerc's heart rate quickened. His previous sense of calm evaporated. The tension in the air shifted from a quiet anticipation to an acute awareness of something approaching. He rushed out of his shelter, stepping into the cold, damp morning, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding around him. Officers were shouting orders, soldiers scrambling to their posts, but the full scope of the situation was still unclear. As Leclerc sprinted toward the beach, his mind raced. Was this truly happening? Had the invasion begun? His thoughts collided, questions swirling with disbelief. He reached the crest of the hill and looked out over the beach, the sight before him rendering him momentarily speechless. The sea, which had seemed so calm just a few hours ago, was now teeming with activity. But it was not the kind of activity he had imagined. The water was filled with ships, more than he could count, an armada moving swiftly toward the shore. It was not just a handful of vessels, not just dozens or hundreds. It was thousands. A sea of ships, stretching as far as the eye could see, all converging toward the beach, each moment bringing them closer. Leclerc's breath caught in his throat. His mind struggled to process the scale of what he was witnessing. This was not the limited assault he had expected, the kind of attack that could be contained by their formidable defenses. This was an invasion. A massive, unrelenting force heading directly for them. The realization hit him with full force, a cold wave of panic spreading through his chest. His belief in the impregnable defenses, his confidence in their victory, seemed to crumble under the weight of this impossible sight. He had expected a fight, yes, but not this. The overwhelming scale of the force before him shattered any remnants of certainty. It was impossible to fathom how they could hold their position against such a force. The invaders were here, not just in force, but with preparation and sheer numbers that Leclerc had never thought possible. He had been trained to expect an enemy that would take their time, that would be limited by their resources. But what he saw in the distance was an enemy ready to give everything for victory. An enemy that had come prepared to push forward with everything they had. The distant roar of engines grew louder as the ships closed in, breaking the eerie silence that had settled over the coastline. The fog seemed to thin just enough to reveal the full extent of the invasion: soldiers, tanks, landing craft, and artillery. They were not just landing. They were coming with overwhelming force, a coordinated assault unlike anything Leclerc had ever experienced or imagined. His mind raced, trying to process the scale, trying to form a plan, but the enormity of the situation left him speechless. All his training, all the countless drills and fortifications, seemed suddenly inadequate in the face of this unrelenting assault. In that moment, Leclerc realized that the war had changed in an instant. The battle for Normandy had begun in earnest, and it was not the battle he had anticipated. His fortress, once thought impenetrable, now seemed to be a mere illusion. The enemy, prepared, determined, and unrelenting, had arrived. All the confidence that had filled him in the quiet days before seemed naive in the face of the reality unfolding before him. Leclerc turned back to his men, but the confidence in his eyes had faded, replaced by a grim realization. They were facing something far bigger than they had ever imagined, and the fight for survival had just begun. The enemy was no longer distant, no longer a shadow on the horizon. They were here, now, in overwhelming force, and the battle for Normandy would be fought on their terms. The once calm beach, which had seemed so peaceful that morning, was about to be torn apart by the fury of war. As the first rays of the sun began to light up the beach, Leclerc stepped forward, his boots sinking slightly into the soft sand. The scene before him was a chaotic blur of activity. From the shoreline, the vast sight of landing craft and massive vessels unloading their troops was overwhelming. The sound of engines roaring, combined with the muffled thud of artillery, filled the air, drowning out everything else. The sight was more than a mere assault. It was a relentless wave crashing onto the beach, one that had been carefully planned and prepared for months. Leclerc's heart raced as he stood frozen for a moment, taking in the sheer scale of the invasion. German soldiers at nearby defensive positions quickly opened fire on the advancing forces. The reports of machine guns firing, artillery shells exploding, and the desperate cries of men caught in the crossfire all mingled into an incoherent, thunderous roar. The once silent beach, which had only a few hours ago been shrouded in fog, now vibrated with the intensity of the battle that had begun in full force. The air was thick with smoke, and the sky was darkened by the dust and debris from explosions. Despite the tremendous firepower of the defenders, it became immediately clear to Leclerc that the attack was not only expected, but planned with devastating precision. The German defense line, which had been constructed with months of labor and was meant to be impenetrable, was now under siege. The high concrete bunkers, the machine gun nests, and the artillery positions were all under direct fire from the advancing Allied troops. It was no longer just about holding the line. The very foundations of their defense were crumbling under the pressure of an enemy that was relentless and well-prepared. As Leclerc surveyed the scene, his mind struggled to process the overwhelming reality. The enemy was not just coming in waves, but seemed to be coming from every direction, supported by airstrikes that shook the ground beneath him. The sound of heavy artillery and bombs was deafening, and every moment felt like an eternity. The German forces, once so sure of their strength, were beginning to falter. The panic was palpable among his comrades as they fired into the advancing ranks, but it was clear that their shots were not enough. The tide of battle had turned decisively, and the enemy's numbers were simply too great. Leclerc felt a sudden and sinking realization that no amount of firepower, no matter how well placed, could turn the tide. His hands shook as he held his rifle, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. His confidence, which had been so unwavering just hours ago, now seemed naive. Every thought he had once held about the strength of their defenses, every belief he had about the certainty of victory, was unraveling in the face of this onslaught. The enemy was too organized, too numerous, and too prepared to be stopped by anything they had. The sand beneath him was now stained with the blood of fallen soldiers, some from his own unit, some from the enemy. The beach, which had looked so peaceful only a day before, was now a battlefield filled with the disfigured remnants of war. The craters in the ground, created by bombs and artillery, seemed to eat away at the once immovable fortifications, leaving only twisted metal and broken concrete in their wake. The sight of his comrades falling around him was a sharp, painful reminder of how fragile their position had become. Leclerc's mind raced as he tried to find a way to rally his troops, to find any glimmer of hope among the destruction. But the air was thick with the smoke of artillery, and the constant barrage made it impossible to hold any thoughts of retaliation. His eyes flickered across the beach, trying to spot any remaining resistance. But all he saw were bodies, German and Allied alike, scattered across the sand, the remnants of a battle that had grown beyond any of their expectations. He moved quickly, trying to coordinate a response, but his strength was waning, and his mind was clouded by the overwhelming chaos. The once pristine defense line was now shattered beyond recognition. The defenses that had been meticulously crafted were now barely a memory, ripped apart by a force they had not anticipated. The enemy was in control, pushing forward relentlessly, and Leclerc knew that his efforts, no matter how desperate, would not be enough to turn the tide. The loss of control was felt in every movement, every desperate attempt to push back the enemy. Leclerc's vision blurred as the sounds of battle rang in his ears. Every shot, every explosion, every cry for help only reinforced the grim reality. His confidence in their superiority had been shattered in a matter of hours. There was no longer any hope of victory on this beach. The battle was lost, and it was only a matter of time before the enemy would reach their positions, overpowering the last remnants of resistance. As he stood there, watching the destruction unfold before him, Leclerc realized with brutal clarity that the war, for all its brutality and destruction, had taken on an entirely new dimension. It was no longer about winning or losing a single battle. The tide of history had shifted, and they had been swept away with it. The war was no longer in their hands. It was in the hands of the invaders, the unstoppable force that had breached the shores of Normandy. By evening, as the battle slowly died down, Lieutenant Leclerc sat in his shelter, his face smeared with dirt and streaked with blood. His uniform bore the marks of the day's brutal combat, torn and stained by the violence that had consumed the beach. Around him lay the bodies of his comrades, some lifeless, others barely recognizable in their final moments. The remnants of the once imposing fortifications were nothing but rubble now. Broken concrete and twisted metal scattered across the battlefield. The vehicles that had been the pride of their defenses were either destroyed or abandoned, their once powerful engines silent in the wake of the assault. Leclerc's mind raced, but it was as if he couldn't comprehend what had just happened. His hands, though still gripped tightly on his rifle, felt heavy, as if they no longer belonged to him. He had been so sure of victory just hours before, confident that the defenses would hold and that the enemy would be repelled. But now, in the quiet aftermath, the enormity of their defeat began to sink in. The enemy had overwhelmed them with force and precision, an unstoppable tide that had crushed their best efforts. The structures that had been so carefully erected to protect their positions had crumbled under the sheer weight of the assault. It was a power they had not anticipated, a tactical superiority that had completely outclassed everything they had planned for. The battlefield was littered with the wreckage of war. What had once been a fortified, seemingly impregnable line of defense now looked like the remnants of a dream, shattered and useless. Leclerc couldn't shake the feeling that everything they had believed in, Their strength, their preparation, had been in vain. The industrial might of the enemy had turned their fortifications into little more than sandcastles in a storm. The machines of war, which they had relied on, lay defeated, unable to resist the overwhelming onslaught of the invaders. As the day wore on, the sounds of combat began to fade. The air, thick with smoke and the scent of gunpowder, started to clear. The horizon, which had been a blur of destruction just hours before, now seemed eerily still. The chaos had subsided, and there was a quietness that felt almost unnatural after the violence that had torn through the area. Leclerc could hear the distant sounds of movement. Perhaps some of his remaining comrades, perhaps not. But there was no denying that the war, at least on this front, was no longer in their hands. He leaned back against the rough wall of his shelter, his eyes unfocused as he stared out at the wreckage before him. His thoughts were heavy, clouded with disbelief and grief. The hope he had carried with him through the long months of war, hope for victory, for survival, had evaporated in the face of this overwhelming force. He had come to realize that victory was not simply a matter of strength or preparation. It was about more than fortifications and weapons. It was about adaptability, about being able to pivot when the world shifted beneath you. And in that, they had failed. The war had changed in ways that Leclerc had not been prepared for. The reality of what had just happened, this crushing defeat, was something he had not anticipated. He had believed in the power of their defenses, in the might of their position. But the enemy had shown him a new face of warfare, one where technology, resources, and sheer willpower could break through even the most formidable defenses. Leclerc closed his eyes for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts, but they swirled together in a fog of exhaustion and disbelief. He felt the weight of loss in his bones, not just the loss of men, of comrades, but the loss of a belief in the invincibility of their defenses. The war, which had always seemed like a series of battles to be won or lost, now seemed more like an endless tide of destruction. It was not a series of victories that would determine the outcome, but an overwhelming, unstoppable force that would crush everything in its path. As the final remnants of the battle faded, Leclerc knew that this was not the end. The war was far from over, but for him, the lessons of this day had already begun to reshape his understanding of it. Victory, he now realized, was not just about strength. It was about resilience, about the ability to adjust to new realities as they arose. And in that, his confidence had been shattered.